Yo, 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 this is Vargas Makery, and the number one question I am being asked is how do you finish these boards? So, welcome to this long ramble of where I show you how I finish my boards every step. First things first is the epoxy I use. I use a login epoxy, never had a problem with it, doesn't gum up, it doesn't, give me any problems through the planer, through the sander, nothing like that. So, to start out with, first thing I do is wait 24 hours minimum for it to dry. Then I'll run it through the planer, but at very short steps. So I barely run it through at first, and then I go around, I do it again, just doing it half a turn. I think it's like 1/32 or something like that. It's just half a turn is the max I will go on on the planer. So then that way it doesn't shave too much. You will see how at the end when I'm done with the planer is that I leave just a tiny little skin of epoxy on there, and that's where I kind of leave it at that, because if you go too much you'll start to chip and stuff like that. You'll notice too on how you'll get lucky and it won't chip and you're like, dang, I'm unstoppable, but it's not like that. So I do recommend leaving that little skin of epoxy. It doesn't take very much to sand. Let's talk about sanding now. So sanding, you can see that I kind of sand at an angle. I did recently upgrade to a Festool Rotex with the Rotex mode, and that makes my life a lot easier. It's well worth the money, and the convenience it brings is really nice. But you don't need it. You can still do it. I used to do these with a DeWalt sander, just a little palm sander, and it works great. So, but make sure it's one of those things that sanding can get very technical, and I'm going to explain to you how I sand. But you can see that I sand at an angle to remove most of the excess off. I also have a vacuum connected to it, and that really helps that too. So I do recommend that, because if you get technical into sanding, you'll start learning that there's cross contamination between grits and all this other stuff, and make sure you have a clean surface when you sand. So keep that in mind as you sand. You will see that the angle that I cut in is I'm keeping a close eye as I'm sanding everything off, that I'm making sure I'm not going way too deep. So as soon as I see epoxy being removed from that surface, I stop sanding it, and I'll start sanding flat to see where I'm at. And then I'll sand at an angle, and then I'll go flat again to look at it. So you can see that pattern going on. With the Rotex, it doesn't take like half a second and it's already off. So just be very careful with that. After you removed all the epoxy on there, and with the Rotex, what I do is that I, of course, sand at an angle, but then after that, I sand flat to make sure that it's a nice flat surface. So yeah, after the surface is flat, make sure you put it through that Rotex mode and just flatten it out. Make sure you can run your hands through it, and it doesn't feel any bumps or stuff like that, because that kind of ruins this next step. So if you don't do that perfectly the first time, you'll notice that whenever you're polishing it, it does not work out. So I don't know if I stated this earlier, but you are grinding the epoxy away with 120 grit sandpaper, and that's the sandpaper I usually like, because if you start at 80, yeah, it does remove it, but you're just adding extra steps to your sanding process. So 120 is good. And this is where we get into the polishing side. Polishing side can be kind of weird. I did mention the technical way of sanding. You want to start out at 120, move up to 150, 180, and then 220, and then 320. After 320, your surface begins to get kind of delicate, so you can set your keys on it and it'll scratch it up. 320, amongst what I heard, is a good point to where to stop. Also, things get kind of weird because the way your finish is absorbed can also be different if you were to go up higher. But of course, if you are doing a clear epoxy, you will have to go to 2000 grit and move on to wet sanding and stuff like that. But let's not get into that. It gets really, really, really crazy whenever you go into that. So yeah, like I was saying, after I get that flat surface with that 120, I'm gonna put it back into orbital mode, where it doesn't turn like an angle grinder. It turns into more of a just regular sander. So after you have it on orbital mode, it's time for sanding and polishing. So what I do is, of course, I start on 120. Make sure you wipe the surface down with a microfiber. That's what I use, because that's where you get into more of the cross contamination, making sure you don't have dust from the 120 grit moving into the 150 and so on. So like every time you get a new sandpaper, make sure you wipe the surface, make sure it's all nice and clean. Next thing in the technical side is sanding in a pattern. So what I do is I kind of just do circles where it's like I start at the top right, go to my left, and then go back down, and then kind of just do a circle. And you could get even more technical and put pencil marks to ensure that you're sanding every bit of it. I've done this for a while, so I make sure that I sand a lot, and make sure I don't miss a spot. But to start out with, I do recommend doing that pencil marks. That way you know how many circles you should be doing between each sandpaper. So you'll move up to the sandpaper, going from 120 to 150 to 180, 220, and 320. Making sure you wipe every time, every sandpaper you wipe down the surface. Make sure it's clean and it's a new surface. A vacuum is highly recommended in this step because, again, with that cross contamination, you're not rubbing the dust on there. It gets really technical, but it does make a difference. So like the more the more of this you apply on your workpiece, the better it'll come out. Alright, so that's pretty much it on the whole sanding side. Just be very cautious. There's plenty of stuff you can learn about sanding and getting that perfect thing. I know a lot of people don't like it, but I did hear somebody say that it's kind of like your signature on your piece, because obviously it's like the last step, one of the last steps in your wood piece. So make sure you take your time, find different ways to enjoy it. Next thing I do is just apply Odie's oil. It's pretty easy. I love this stuff. I have used other oils that I don't really want to say because I don't want to bring them down, and I still like them for certain things. It does make your wood darker on some of them, so like different finishes let the wood absorb it differently, and there's some finishes that make your wood piece darker, so I like that. So it's different, but Odie's oil is just like one of those oils that just works. Like, I don't like it where it makes my wood too dark on the dark walnut. It just leaves a nice finish. It smells great. It's kind of like, it has like organic, so it's not like too chemically. It's not like it's one of those things like you open it and you can breathe it. It's not like you smell it and you're like, oh snap, like this cannot be healthy to be inhaling right now. So that's one of the reasons why I like Odie's oil. On the directions it just says buff on, buff off, and that's pretty much it. I do it 2 times. Wipe it on there, let it sit, and then buff it off, and then do just a quick, buff on, and then I just buff it off, just wipe it off real quick and all that. And that's pretty much it on how I go from dried epoxy to shaving it, to sanding it, to polishing it, to applying oil. Yeah, and absolutely, if anybody has any questions, just let me know. I answer most of them. All my DMs are still open. So yeah, hit me up. Appreciate you guys listening. This long ramble. I didn't want to put too much like crazy effort, trying to make this like cinematic or any way. I just wanted to put the information out there and absorb what you want to absorb. And yeah, didn't want to leave anything out. Hopefully you guys learned something. If you guys have any questions, remember, hit me up. Yeah.